Hi all. Well, we've come full circle. Or maybe you could say we've gone up the mountain and now we're gonna ski on down. It's time for us to begin our last unit of this series of 7 units. And this unit is moving us forward. We're moving past the blues and we're entering an era of allies. We're also going to be talking about the marketplace of ideas. This is something that we actually introduced at the beginning of our very first unit when we talked about all of the isms that were becoming very popular at the end of the 1800s and influenced the 20th century dramatically. These are things like colonialism or isolationism. These isms will play a big part in the story of World War II. We're going to begin in a very general way, and we're going to talk about several isms and how they shaped this world of World War II. And the one we need to start with is maybe one that we're so familiar with that we don't even recognize it because it's a part of us, and that would be capitalism. We've already talked about capitalism, referring to it as the investment of capital so that you can make more capital. You can make more money by investing things. And the idea of a stock market means that you can have a small portion of a company and the risk to you is a lot less than if you owned the whole company. And so people pool their money and their resources and they try to make more money. And this usually involved sending ships to a faraway place to get things that weren't available in your country. That's how capitalism developed. But capitalism in the 20th century came to be centered on the stock market. Stock markets were all about roller coaster rides, ups and downs, and dramatic changes of fortune. And so this is the story of the Roaring '20s and the stock market crash and then the Great Depression. And we've seen that movie before. So why would people want to keep riding that roller coaster? The idea is this is a kind of freedom. It's the freedom to own your own property and not be told by the government how much you can earn as a worker. And it expresses the idea that there's no limit to your life. In the US, we call this the American dream. It's the idea that you can start with nothing and you can become whatever you want to be. And it has to do with capitalism and the stock market, or at least investing freely. In Europe, they experienced the Great Depression just as the United States had. And this showed the interrelatedness of world markets. And what was happening after World War I, particularly in Germany, was a struggle to try to change the way that they had done things for centuries. They had a new republic called the Weimar Republic, and they had a sense of freedom. But the problem was that the government was weak and Germany's enemies from World War I wanted revenge. And that came in the form of reparations, payments for the damages that had been done during World War I, and this was a part of the Treaty of Versailles. Because Germany faced this kind of punishment, it was very difficult for their economy to get going. And what happened was hyperinflation. Prices just kept going up and started to go up kind of like an exponential rise. And it seemed like it would never stop. People were hauling wheelbarrows full of money in order to buy a loaf of bread because the money was practically worthless. one loaf of bread for millions of marks, Deutschmarks, which is the German money, or Reichsmarks. And so this hyperinflation led to basically it led to unemployment, and it led to an inability for people to meet their basic needs. And it led to a dissatisfaction with the government. So even capitalism, while it gives us freedom, it can also be out of control, especially if the government isn't strong enough or wealthy enough to provide unemployment insurance or Social Security or healthcare like Medicare eventually. One thing that was active in Germany that was similar to what happened in the United States was labor movements. Labor movements were gaining strength, and especially labor movements that were socialist in nature. Remember, socialism led to the eventual revolution or revolutions in Russia. And so many of these labor unions were fighting for the government to take more control and to give workers more benefits and to basically abandon some of the ideas of a free market capitalist economy. One thing that happened, and this is a leftover from World War I, is there was a sense that the economy was too closely connected with the military. During World War I, there were many accusations that arms dealers, especially in the United States, were making money on other people's pain. Remember that the United States remained neutral until 1917, but there was evidence that arms dealers were basically looking for the highest bidder. They didn't care which side bought their weapons as long as they could make money. And this military economy came to be known as the Merchants of Death. That was the name of a book written in 1934, and it was generally trying to expose this economy that was too closely connected to the military. So in 1934, the U.S. Senate established the Special Committee investigating the munitions industry. And this was led by Senator Gerald P. Nye of North Dakota. And so the committee was called the Nye Committee. And its goal was to find out how these munitions companies had made money during World War I. And eventually what happened is people, because they were sick of war and they were sick of these weapons leading to war, the United States passed the Neutrality Act of 1935. And this basically said that the United States would not fight in other people's wars and would not meddle in other people's conflicts. And more neutrality acts were passed in 1936, 1937, and then again in 1939. And these all were important factors. We'll talk about it a little bit later. They isolated the United States. And so isolationism, once again, was the policy of many people in the U.S. and even in the U.S. government. One thing that was happening was countries around the world, because they wanted economic growth, they looked to find resources. And one country in particular, Japan, had very few resources, but was a growing power in the world. Japan had been involved in the war with China and then the war with Russia at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, and they had been very successful. And then they joined in World War I, partly because they wanted a piece of the pie. And then at the Paris Peace Conference, they did receive some of the German colonies, specifically Qingdao in China, and were allowed to be in Manchuria. And this was a benefit for Japan, but Japan actually wanted to pass a racial equality clause in the governing documents for the League of Nations, basically to establish the idea that all people of all races are equal. But there was resistance in the United States. There was racism, particularly in California. And because of that, the Japanese people were very angry after the Versailles Conference, just like the Chinese people. The Chinese people were very angry because their territory had been taken and given to Japan, even though they had fought with the Allies in World War I as well. So Japan was rising as a world power, but it had very few resources. Specifically, it didn't have oil and rubber, and those are the things that help you build vehicles, and specifically military vehicles and military weapons in general, and even ships and things like that. And so oil and rubber were resources that Japan needed. Japan had more and more strength because of its growing economy and industrialization, and it was able to have some resources from Taiwan and from Manchuria, but it didn't have enough. And it wanted to expand its sphere of influence. If you remember that phrase, sphere of influence is this circle of power that surrounds Japan, and it would include Korea and parts of China then, and Taiwan. And so oil was very important as the lifeblood of capitalism, and Japan needed it. And that would eventually lead to a showdown between Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Now, another ism that we've already discussed at length is communism. Communism is often seen as the opposite of capitalism because communism is a system where the government takes charge of all of the resources of society and divides them equally. Now, we know that it's pretty impossible for human beings to do things perfectly and equally. And that's exactly what happened with communism. But people still felt that this at least protected the average worker in the factory or the peasant on the farm. And certainly it kept people from getting out of control like it happened with the Roaring Twenties and the economy of the Roaring Twenties and the stock market and its crash. So in Russia, after the revolutions of 1917, communism was established, and gradually we know that Vladimir Lenin led the country, but after the Civil War, he died, and Stalin made a power grab and got rid of Trotsky, and as a result, instead of Leninism in Russia, you had Stalinism, and Stalinism meant that you would have a military dictatorship and a totalitarian government. And we'll talk about those issues, those isms later. Totalitarianism is a very important ism for World War II. Stalin, like Lenin before him, established 5-year plans. And this is a government plan for industry and agriculture to change things very quickly. And basically targets and goals are set and workers are pushed to meet those goals. And if they don't, there are consequences. For farmers, it meant that even though they grew food, sometimes they were starving if they didn't grow enough food. It's a little bit like a very abusive parent who doesn't allow the child to have the things that they need as a kind of punishment. And so you have these 5-year plans that are carried out by the government. We call this a command economy. So it's not driven by the market. It's not driven by supply and demand. Supply is how much you have of something, and demand is how much people want that thing. And generally those forces cross, and that's the market price. That's called equilibrium. It's the market price. And prices go up if the supply is lower, because people still want something, but there's less of it. I know that that's a very quick explanation of supply and demand, but it's a start. Stalin was ruthless. We know from the book Animal Farm the idea of how something that starts with maybe good intentions to help people ends up in ruthless domination and torture and horror, really. And so what happened during the 1930s, Stalin carried out what was known as the Great Purge. And this basically amounted to his getting rid of any political opponents, including people like Trotsky. That happened earlier, but the Great Purge meant that Stalin was consolidating his power. He was getting rid of any rival and making himself a supreme leader. Communism was attractive to many people around the world. In Spain, there were communists that rose up against the government, which was a nationalist government that had tried to get rid of the republic. That basically it's a back and forth between, do you let a king or a monarch rule, or do you just have the people vote democratically and run their country on their own? And there is a tradition in European countries connected to monarchies. It's their national pride. And so the nationalism that was in Spain had to do with wanting to have a monarchy that was Roman Catholic in nature. And what happened is you had communists who were insurgents. They were fighting against that nationalist government. And the nationalist government was run by Francisco Franco. And Franco was ruthless. He was a Stalin protege, and the result was horrific. Mass executions and abuses, human rights atrocities, and genocide of those communists or communist sympathizers. It included many different groups of people, including Protestants who weren't Catholic, and many other groups who were just different in some way. And so you had the Spanish Civil War. You also had the Chinese Civil War. And these were happening simultaneously. And both of them acquired the title, the White Terror. The White Terror was a military action, a nationalist military action against communists. And it happened in China under Chiang Kai-shek in the 1930s. It actually started a little bit earlier in the 1920s because there was a fight between nationalists and communists in China. And it happened during the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. And so communism is a force that is rising up, and communists are against nationalists and fascists. And the Nazis represent both fascists and nationalists. And so communists and Nazis were mortal enemies, and that would impact the way this march toward war took place. Now, apart from the economy, which is what we've been talking about, a communist command economy and a capitalist market economy, there's something else we need to discuss, and it's democracy. The idea that people get to decide what government they have and what laws are passed. And you can actually have a democratic socialist country. Those things seem to be going against each other because socialists want the government to have more power and more control. And generally, democracy is the idea that you can have more freedom and less government oppression. But you can have democratic socialists. We've even had that discussed in our day. But what you need to know is in the United States, during the Great Depression, the country moved dramatically, giving the government more control. Some people would accuse FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of creating a kind of socialist government with his New Deal. At the same time, the people kept electing him. They saw him as someone who cared about them, and they gave Congress the right to pass sweeping new programs. So the New Deal was a part of democracy. It was chosen by the people. And those programs could be changed eventually, and they were repeatedly. The problem is, in the democracy of the United States and democracies in other countries, not all people were equal. Specifically, there was segregation in the United States. There was a division between black people and white people, and this showed that you didn't really have true democracy. Women had gained the right to vote, but there was still a sense that they were second-class citizens. And labor unions weren't quite ready to accept women to be full participants. But women had proven that they could do anything that men were doing, and they were absolutely necessary, especially in a time of war, where so many men were off at war. Women were needed to run the country and run the factories and make things happen. So there was more respect within a democracy for women's say in things. And this was true in Germany as well. It was true in other countries that didn't have a full democracy necessarily. One other thing that you need to know that was happening was the draft. Up until this time, when there wasn't a war, people were not required to be in the military. And this is different from other countries. The United States was a democracy where people could choose to be in the military or not. And this is a part of the freedom that Americans had enjoyed for so long. And so in 1940, the United States established the Selective Service System. And this was basically the first peacetime draft ever in the United States. And so democracy was evolving. There was this understanding that war could break out and people needed to be willing to enter the military if they were called on. And the draft was officially ended in 1973, but even today the Selective Service continues to register all young men, and this is in case the draft has to be reinstituted, started again, that the list of names is ready to go to get people into the military if need be. So this is a very interesting reality. Within a democracy, you have freedom, you choose, you vote on laws, but there are also ways that the government has to force people to support the country, especially in times of war. Now, not everybody agrees with war, and there were many conscientious objectors to the idea of war, especially in light of World War I and continuing all the way through World War II. And those people didn't agree that the government should make people sign up for the military or be ready to sign up for the military. And so this led to a movement to keep America out of war so that American men and women would not have to make such great sacrifices for someone else's problems. And this led to the passage of those Neutrality Acts of 1935, 36, 37, and 39. And it also led to what was called the America First Committee. The America First Committee was a committee that said, wait a minute, we do not want to get into another war, no matter what. This committee involved many famous people over the years, and it was basically a committee to preserve America's freedom to do what it wanted to do and not be pulled into someone else's problems. And it involved famous people like future presidents Gerald Ford and JFK, John F. Kennedy. They both supported the America First Committee. So did someone else named Charles Lindbergh. And we've already discussed the fact that some of the things that he wrote and said, they leaned toward anti-Semitism, blaming American Jews for some of the problems that were going on. And in particular, Charles Lindbergh spoke out against American Jews who wanted America, the United States, to get into the war because of what was happening to Jewish people in Germany and in Europe. He sympathized with them, or he said that he did, and he said it was understandable that they would be upset and would not want that type of thing to happen, but he stood firm on his idea that America should not get involved in the war. And then Pearl Harbor happened. And basically we should acknowledge that Charles Lindbergh accepted that after that incident, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was no turning back and America should get into the war. So he supported America in a different way. And we can understand that in a democracy, you have differences of opinion. You have people who speak out loudly because of our freedom of speech. And we may not always agree with their ideas or their perspectives or the way they say things, but we do have gratitude that we have the opportunity to have differences. Now we need to talk about an ism that is in some ways unique to the 20th century, but reminds us of episodes from the past where authoritarian leaders took charge of a country and ruthlessly eliminated all of his or her enemies. And this is called fascism. Fascism is really the invention of Benito Mussolini in the 1920s. Benito Mussolini was a socialist. He was a writer similar to Joseph Stalin, writing about socialism, living on the streets, fighting as a revolutionary. But Mussolini rejected socialism, and he had a whole new plan for taking control of the country and creating a fascist party. Eventually, he created something called fascism, which gathered people around him to basically get rid of what he saw as a weak and corrupt government. And he led a march on Rome in 1922 with his black shirts, the gang that he surrounded himself with, and they were able eventually to take charge. He served as basically the leader of the country with the approval of the king, but essentially the king wasn't powerful anymore. It was all about this man named Mussolini, and he was known as Il Duce. Il Duce means the leader, the supreme leader, Il Duce Suprema. And his whole goal was to reestablish the Roman Empire, and at least a kind of Roman Empire, and to restore the glory of Italy. Remember, Italy had only been a country since 1871 officially, so he had to go far back into history, and he inspired the other fascists around the world, whether it was Adolf Hitler or Francisco Franco. Let's talk about Hitler. Hitler basically took power at the same time that FDR became president. This is during the chaos of the Great Depression. The country was looking for leadership, someone to save them from hyperinflation and the weak and corrupt Weimar Republic. And so Hitler gained support. At first, people weren't ready to accept him. In 1923, he tried to do what Mussolini had done. He tried to lead an uprising, a putsch, at a beer hall in Munich, but he was put in prison. And during the time in prison, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle, and it presented all of his ideas for the future Germany, and specifically his racist ideas, blaming Jewish people for all of Germany's problems and ranting and raving about the Treaty of Versailles and revenge against France. And when he was appointed chancellor by Paul von Hindenburg, who had been a military leader during World War I and became the leader of the Weimar Republic, von Hindenburg had no choice but to make Hitler his chancellor. And eventually then Hitler gained power because his party, his brown shirts, gained representation in the Reichstag, which was the Congress, the parliament in Germany. And when Hitler had power, he basically banned all other political parties, and he suspended the civil rights of Jewish people. That was one of the first actions that he took in his long road to what he called the final solution. And that involved concentration camps. Now, he used camps for all of his enemies, including socialists or people who were of a different religion, Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. Anyone who is different, he put in those camps. Some pastors who were Lutheran pastors or Christian pastors, priests, they were put in concentration camps if they opposed him. Hitler banned crucifixes in churches, and he basically wanted a religion of the state. One of the first moments where he acted ruthlessly was called the Night of Long Knives, and it actually was more than one night. It was 3 nights, from June 30th to July 2nd, 1934. And basically Hitler was working with a military group called the Sturmabteilung. The Sturmabteilung is the SA, and this is a military organization, and Hitler was one leader, but there were other rival leaders, and basically using his power in the government, he was able to send out people to assassinate the leaders that were his rivals and to decapitate or get rid of that leadership and purge anyone who was against him. So very similar to Stalin, he was a ruthless leader, even getting rid of people who were technically on the same side. In addition, he continued his oppression and movement against Jewish people with the Night of Broken Glass, which is actually November 9th and 10th in 1938. And this happened because his brown shirts, his stormtroopers went around and broke the windows of shops and synagogues, and there was glass all over the street. And then Hitler made the Jewish people clean up the mess. This was just the beginning, and already Jewish people were being sent to concentration camps and were being exterminated. Now, this was known as the final solution. Hitler's idea was, how quickly can we get rid of this Jewish population, not just in Germany, but throughout Europe? And this is known today as the Holocaust. Holocaust is a word that means complete burning, complete tragedy. And I hope this helps you understand how Hitler came to power and how he started implementing these terrible programs. And some of these programs are actually called pogroms. Pogroms are when you have a riot against people who are different according to their race or religion. And that is sometimes the word that's referred to the night of broken glass. In German, it's called Kristallnacht. And so these pogroms were Hitler's programs of violence. After Mussolini and Hitler, you had many other world leaders who were following suit and were trying to become fascist dictators of their countries. And this included Franco. During the Civil War of 1936 to 1939, he established himself as the nationalist leader of the country and was seeking to annihilate all of the communist revolutionaries in that country. And that was known again as the White Terror, similar to Chiang Kai-shek's White Terror to get rid of communists in China. And there was also Emperor Hirohito. This emperor was known as the Showa Emperor, and he was actually a proponent of peace, more or less. He was not a militaristic leader, but the military was gaining more and more power within the country. Now, the main thing to know about Japan's type of fascism is that, number one, it involved military leaders who were passionate about restoring Japanese pride and standing up for the essence of what it meant to be Japanese. So this is a strong nationalism. There were different groups in the military, and they were often fighting each other and seeking to overthrow the government with a coup d'etat. And there were several prime ministers that were assassinated during this kind of chaotic period. This effort to have a restoration, it goes back to 1868. And this is after the American Commodore Matthew Perry took American warships into Tokyo Harbor, and demanded that Japan open up to the rest of the world. This was a humiliation for Japan. It ended up resulting in the overthrow of the government and the establishment of what became known as the Meiji Emperor. So Meiji was the name of the emperor, and the period was called the Meiji Restoration. It was the period of industrializing Japan. So all the way back to 1868, this was starting, but a Showa restoration was being demanded during the 1920s and 1930s because the Showa emperor named Hirohito, he was the symbol of the country. And in 1868, with the Meiji Restoration, the idea was promoted that the emperor was the figure that could unite the country because he was the descendant of a god. He was a god himself. And so Hirohito was promoted by this Showa state group. It's called Showa statism, when it's like a religion to worship the emperor. And Hirohito, the Showa emperor, was promoted as this unifying figure, even though he really didn't want war. Increasingly then, Japan became more and more militaristic, and they were abandoning the rest of the world, who was telling them that they couldn't expand their power. In 1931, the Japanese invaded Manchuria, and this is known as the Mukden incident. This happened in Manchuria, which is part of China. And remember that Japan was given a colony called Qingdao in China. It had belonged to Germany, and it was given to the Japanese at the Versailles Conference. And so Japan was in China, and they were building railroads and harvesting the resources there. And then there was an incident, a terrorist attack. Only it turns out, it was discovered later on, that the Japanese themselves actually tried to blow up the railroad track, and they didn't even succeed. But the Japanese military used this as an excuse to have a full-scale invasion of Manchuria, which is the northeastern portion of China. So this is leading to military confrontation. The League of Nations included Japan as one of the 4 main members, and the League of Nations sent a committee called the Lytton Commission was sent to China to investigate what had happened with this Mukden or Manchurian incident. And they basically didn't want to take sides. They said maybe the Chinese had caused this to happen, but the Japanese had some blame in this too. When the Japanese heard this rebuke, they left the League of Nations. And this was eventually one of the reasons that the League of Nations would collapse. Japan left, Germany eventually left, and Italy didn't really care what happened, but they, for all purposes, they were basically not part of the League of Nations. And so the League of Nations was not doing its job and was not effective. So the Showa statism was a cult of the emperor in Japan, and it led to complete government control, telling people that they had to sacrifice their freedom and serve as a part of the state, and that basically telling them that they were not separate from the state, but were one body that should go together in unity. And this led to further Southeast Asian aggression at Pearl Harbor for sure, but then in the Philippines and in Malaysia, which was controlled by the British. We'll talk more later about Pearl Harbor and the events that led up to it, but you can see the world shaping up for a global conflict. There was also fascism in other places like China and Mexico. Wang Jingwei was a leader within the Communist Party, or the KMT, the Kuomintang Party. The political parties of China at this time had a tendency to become fascist, and their nationalism, their desire to make China strong, meant getting rid of anyone who was different, especially communists. And so Wang Jingwei was a fascist leader within the Nationalist Party in China. In addition, you had a leader in Mexico. His name was Nicolas Rodriguez Carrasco, and Carrasco was responsible for a group called ARM, which was a revolutionary movement that was fascist and wanted to get rid of all of the Chinese people in Mexico. And basically, the group wore gold shirts as opposed to the black shirts of Mussolini or the brown shirts of Hitler. They had gold shirts, and this was going back to the idea of El Dorado, the mythical golden man from Latin American myth. And so you have people who wanted to have complete control of their country, and it often meant that they had to force people to believe in a kind of religion that made the leader almost like a god. And so we have this gallery of fascist dictators that dominated countries around the world and that pushed the world toward war. And this included Stalin in the Soviet Union. It included Mussolini, who wanted to establish a new Roman Empire. It included the Emperor Showa, Hirohito, in Japan, even though he may have been somewhat of a a peaceful leader. He gave in to the military rulers, the military generals, and he was actually the one who approved more than 300 poison gas attacks on the Chinese people during World War II. So he is not innocent. He was still in charge. Franco, we see the evidence in the mass graves left behind that have been uncovered of his victims when he executed dozens of communists at a time. And finally, Adolf Hitler, the man who, because of his totalitarianism, executed 6 million Jews. Totalitarianism is when the government is everything. Totalitarianism is when the government controls everything. It controls what people do, what they say, what they believe, and it is a way to make everyone the same, whether they want to be the same or not. Totalitarianism is the opposite of freedom. It exists today. We should be looking out for it. And when a leader makes it sound like only he or she can run the country and only he or she has the right answers, we should question that leader. We should ask why. We should ask, what does this mean for you and me? Thanks for watching.